Hi, friends. So today we're going to read the chapters 10 and 11. And if you'd like to listen while I read and read along in your book at the same time, I invite you to do that. If you are listening to me read it, please also follow along in your book with your eyes so that you recognize the words also on the page. Okay. Chapter 10 starts on page 57. The first portion is in brown text, and it's Naya's story, Southern Sudan, 2008. The men finished their meeting. They all stood and walked past Naya's house. Naya joined the crowd of children following them. A few minutes' walk beyond her house, there was a tree. The men stopped at the tree, and the strangers talked to Naya's uncle some more. There was another tree, some 50 paces past the first one. 50 paces is like 50 steps. With Naya's uncle beside him, one of the men stopped at the halfway point. The other man walked the rest of the way and examined the second tree. The first man called out to his friend in a language Naya did not understand. The friend answered in the same language, but as he walked back toward the group, he translated for the chief, and Naya could hear him. "This is the spot, halfway between the two largest trees. We will find water here." Naya shook her head. What were they talking about? She knew that place like the back of her own hand. It was there, between the two trees, that the village sometimes gathered to sing and talk around a big fire. There wasn't a single drop of water in that spot, unless it was raining. Now we shift to Salva's story, Southern Sudan, 1985. Salva reached for his gourd. Remember, that's where they carry water. He knew it to be half full, but suddenly it felt much lighter, as if there was hardly any water left in it. Uncle Juir must have guessed what he was thinking. "No, Salva," he murmured, "you are too small and not strong enough yet. Without water, you will not survive the rest of the walk. Some of the others, they will be able to manage better than you." Sure enough, there were now 3 women giving water to the men on the ground. Like a miracle, the small amounts of water revived them. They were able to stagger to their feet and join the group as the walking continued. But their 5 dead companions were left behind. There were no tools with which to dig, and besides, burying the men would have taken too much time. Salva tried not to look as he walked past the bodies, but his eyes were drawn in their direction. He knew what would happen. Vultures would find the bodies and strip them of their rotting flesh until only the bones remained. He felt sick at the thought of those men, first dying in such a horrible way, and then having even their corpses ravaged. If he were older and stronger, would he have given water to those men? Or would he, like most of the group, have kept his water for himself? Boy, that's a difficult decision, isn't it? It was the group's 3rd day in the desert. By sunset, they would be out of the desert, and after that, it would not be far to the Etang refugee camp in Ethiopia. As they trudged through the heat, when you trudge, you're walking really slowly, with difficulty. Salva finally had a chance to talk to Uncle about a worry that had been growing like a long shadow across his thoughts. "Uncle, if I am in Ethiopia, how will my parents ever find me? When will I be able to go back to Lewin Arik?" "I have talked to the others here," Uncle said. "We believe that the village of Lewin Arik was attacked and probably burned. Your family..." Uncle paused and looked away. When he looked back again, his face was solemn, serious. "Salva, few people survived the attack on the village. Anyone still alive would have fled into the bush, and no one knows where they are now." Salva was silent for a moment. Then he said, "At least you will be there with me, in Ethiopia." Uncle's voice was gentle. "No, Salva, I am going to take you to the refugee camp, but then I will return to Sudan to fight in the war." Salva stopped walking and clutched at his uncle's arm. "But uncle, I will have no one. Who will be my family?" Uncle gently loosened Salva's grip so he could take the boy's hand in his. There will be many other people in the camp. You will become friends with some of them. You will make a kind of family there. They too will need people they can depend on. Salva shook his head, unable to imagine what life would be like in the camp without Uncle. He squeezed Uncle's hand tightly. Uncle stood and said nothing more. He knows it will be hard for me, Salva realized. He does not want to leave me there, but he has to go back and fight for our people. I mustn't act like a baby. I must try to be strong. Salva swallowed hard. Uncle, when you go back to Sudan, you might meet my parents somewhere. You could tell them where I am, or you could talk to those you meet and ask where the people of Luan Arik are now. Uncle did not answer right away. Then he said, Of course I will do that, nephew. Salva felt a tiny spark of hope. With Uncle looking for his family, there was a chance they might all be together again one day. No one in the group had eaten anything for 2 days. Their water was nearly gone. Only the vision of leaving the desert kept them moving through the heat and dust. Early that afternoon, they came across the first evidence that the desert was receding, like ending. A few stunted trees, very short trees, near a shallow pool of muddy water. The water was unfit to drink, but a dead stork lay by the pond's edge. Immediately, the group began to make preparations to cook and eat the big bird. Salva helped gather twigs for the fire. As the bird roasted, Salva could hardly keep his eyes off of it. There would only be enough for a bite or two for each person, but he could hardly wait. Then he heard loud voices. Along with the rest of the group, he turned and saw 6 men coming towards them. As the men approached, he could see that they were armed with guns and machetes. The men began shouting, Sit down! Hands on your heads! All of you! Now! Everyone in the group sat down at once. Salva was afraid of the weapons, and he could see the others were too. One of the men walked among the group and stopped in front of Uncle. Salva could tell by the ritual scarring on the man's face that he was from the Nuer tribe. Are you with the rebels? The man asked. No, Uncle answered. Where have you come from? Where are you going? We have come from the west of the Nile, Uncle said. We are going to Etang, to the refugees camp. The man told Uncle to get up and leave his gun where it was. 2 of the other men took Uncle to a tree several yards away and tied him to it. Then the men moved among the group. If anyone was carrying a bag, the men opened it and took whatever was in it. They ordered some people to remove their clothing and took that too. Salva was trembling, shaking. Even in the midst of his fear, he realized that for the first time on this trip, it was a good thing to be the youngest and the smallest. The men would not be interested in his clothes. When the men finished their looting, that means stealing, they picked up Uncle's gun. Then they walked to the tree where Uncle was tied up. Maybe they will leave us alone now that they have robbed us, Salva thought. He heard them laughing. As Salva watched, one of the men aimed his gun at Uncle. 3 shots rang out. Then the men ran away. Chapter 11. Southern Sudan, 2008. This is Naya's story. After the 2 men left the village, the task of clearing more of the land between the trees began. It was very hard work. The smaller trees and bushes had to be burned and uprooted. The long grass had to be scythed and hoed under. That means cut down with a special tool and then mixed into the soil. It was dangerous work too, as poisonous snakes and scorpions hid in the grass. Naya was still making the 2 daily trips to the pond. Each time she returned, she could see that slowly but surely the patch of cleared earth was growing larger. The earth was dry and rock hard. Naya felt puzzled and doubtful. How could there be water in such a place? And when she asked Depp that question, he shook his head. She could see the doubt in his eyes, too. Southern Sudan and Ethiopia, 1985. They buried Uncle in a hole about 2 feet deep, a hole that had already been made by some kind of animal. Out of respect for him, the group walked no more that day, but took time to mourn the man who had become their leader. When you mourn someone, it means you take time to be sad and say goodbye to them. Salva was too numb to think. He couldn't feel anything. And when thoughts did come to him, they seemed silly. He was annoyed that they had not been able to eat after all. While the men had been looting the group, more birds arrived and pecked at the roasted stork until there was nothing but bones. The time for grief, sadness, was short, and the walking began again soon after dark. Despite the numbness in his heart, Salva was amazed to find himself walking faster and more boldly than he had before. Like he was brave somehow. Mariel was gone. Uncle was gone too, murdered by those Nuer men right before Salva's eyes. Mariel and Uncle were no longer by his side, and they would never be again. But Salva knew that both of them would have wanted him to survive, to finish the trip and reach the Itang refugee camp safely. It was almost as if they had left their strength with him to help him on the journey. He could not think of any other explanation for the way he felt, but there was no doubt. Beneath his terrible sadness, he felt stronger. Now that Salva was without Uncle's care and protection, the group's attitude towards him changed. Once again, they grumbled that he was too young and small and that he might slow them down or start crying again as he had in the desert. No one shared anything with him, neither food nor company. Uncle had always shared the animals and birds he shot with everyone in the group, but it seemed they had forgotten all that, for now Salva had to beg for scraps, which were given grudgingly, meaning he had to beg them to give him a little bit of food, and they did, but they didn't really want to. The way they were treating him made Salva feel stronger still. There's no one left to help me. They think I am weak and useless. Salva lifted his head proudly. They are wrong, and I will prove it. Salva had never before seen so many people in one place at the same time. How could there be this many people in the world? More than hundreds, more than thousands, thousands upon thousands. People in lines and masses and clumps, people milling around, standing, sitting, or crouching on the ground, lying down with their legs curled up because there was not enough room to stretch out. The refugee camp at Itang was filled with people of all ages, men, women, girls, small children, but most of the refugees were boys and young men who had run away from their villages when the war came. They had run because they were in double danger, from the war itself and from the armies on both sides. Young men and sometimes even boys were often forced to join the fighting, which was why their families and communities, including Salva's schoolmaster, had sent the boys running into the bush at the first sign of fighting. Children who arrived at the refugee camp without their families were grouped together, so Salva was separated at once from the people he had traveled with. Even though they had not been kind to him, at least he had known them. Now, among strangers once again, he felt uncertain and maybe even afraid. As he walked through the camp with several other boys, Salva glanced at every face he passed. Uncle had said that no one knew where his family was for certain, so wasn't there at least a chance that they might be here in this camp? Salva looked around at the masses of people stretched out as far as he could see. He felt his heart sink a little, but he clenched his hands into fists and made himself a promise. If they are here, I will find them. After so many weeks of walking, Salva found it strange to be staying in one place. During that long, terrible trek, finding a safe place to stop and stay for a while had been desperately important. But now that he was at the camp, he felt restless, almost as if he should begin walking again. The camp was safe from the war. There were no men with guns or machetes, no planes with bombs overhead. On the evening of his very first day, Salva was given a bowl of boiled maize to eat, and another one the next morning. That is kind of like corn mush. Already things were better here than they had been during the journey. During the afternoon of the second day, Salva picked his way slowly through the crowds. Eventually, he found himself standing near the gate that was the main entrance to the camp, watching the new arrivals enter. It did not seem as if the camp could possibly hold any more, but still they kept coming, long lines of people. Some emaciated, that means very, very skinny. Some hurt or sick, all exhausted, which means very, very tired. As Salva scanned the faces, a flash of orange caught his eye. Orange, an orange headscarf. He began pushing and stumbling past people. Someone spoke to him angrily, but he did not stop to excuse himself. He could still see the vivid spot of orange. Yes, it was a headscarf. The woman's back was to him, but she was tall like his mother. He had to catch up. But there were too many people in the way. A half sob broke free from Salva's lips, like kind of crying. He mustn't lose track of her. And there the chapter ends. So for today, now in your notebooks, I want you to record on Naya's side. The important things from chapter 10 and 11 together are that the men are saying they can dig between the two big trees and find water. And Naya can't believe that. So write that in your notebook on Naya's side. And on Salva's side, we need to write the very, very sad thing that happened in this chapter, that his uncle was killed. But then that Salva arrived at the camp and Salva is safe. So I want you to write those two things down for these chapters on Salva's side. And tomorrow we will find out if the person with the orange headscarf is Salva's mother. Take a picture of your work after you've written it in your notebook and submit it on Google Classroom. All right, and I will see you guys tomorrow.